But we're going to move on now to, well, actually, one of the best headlines I saw in November, and it
Mhm.
comes from the Sun, and I make no apologies for this. Normally, the Sun, the Mail, they're a bit sort of like, "Ugh, do we really have to reference them?" But the Sun had such a great headline here. Stonehenge. See what they did there? Builders
Yes.
digging tunnel beneath Stonehenge will be haunted by ancient spirits, says Britain's Druid king. The inimitable, the for me, slightly problematic King Arthur Pendragon has warned that an ancient spirit is resting below Stonehenge and will be unleashed upon any who dare dig into the soil around the monument. And that's where we kick off, really, I suppose. Another
It's where
Stonehenge-focused segment.
everybody's kicking off, to be
It's where
frank.
everyone's kicking off. Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, and I'll let you take. I'll let you go from here. I just wanted to introduce this notion of. Obviously, I don't think Arthur Pendragon um, necessarily knows what he's talking about. But anyway, it's a lovely way to start this segment.
Yeah, I mean, being serious for a moment, this is probably one of the most significant crunch moments for UK archaeology, certainly in our working lifetimes.
Yes.
Um, Basically, what's happened is when we've been following the story on Watching Brief for years now. Um, but the Highways England, which is the government's arm's length roads building and managing authority,
Hmm.
wants to upgrade the A303 on the Stonehenge World Heritage Site because they argue that it's a pinch point for traffic going to the West Country, um, and they want to increase traffic flows and increase road capacity, as do a number of local people. They particularly at holiday times and during the summer and so
Hmm.
on, the local roads, they argue, get clogged by tourist traffic and just don't have the capacity to absorb the number of visitors going to Stonehenge, which is one of the country's leading paid visitor attractions.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's the Stone Circle, that is the most famous part, probably, of the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site. Although, what, and this is the problem, what we now have is one of the most studied and remarkable prehistoric landscapes, certainly in southern Britain. I know people in other parts of the country do sometimes get annoyed at the amount of attention Stonehenge gets, but I think
Who
it has
who
to be
does
admitted
that,
that
Andy? Who gets annoyed at that? I can't think of anyone. Who who
uh,
who could possibly be frustrated at how Stonehenge, which isn't even the henge, by the way, gets completely focused on to the
I
exclusion of
didn't I
hundreds, if
wasn't
not thousands, of other
talking about
prehistoric monuments in this country? I can't think of anyone who would be so annoyed by that. I mean, anyway, sorry, continue. I'll try and come up with a list of people who might be annoyed.
it happens to have been recognised as being of universal value by the UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. So there we go. I think I'll rest that there. We can argue about that another time.
It's certainly
It
iconic.
also, it's certainly iconic, and it makes English heritage a large amount of money.
Yes.
Um, anyway, to cut to the chase, the plan has been for a long time to upgrade the A303. The plan grew from a surface dual carriageway, which everybody suddenly realised actually was an abomination,
Mm.
through a cut and cover tunnel, which would equally have been an abomination for the amount of ground that would have been destroyed, the amount of archaeology that would have been destroyed, to a tunnel. And then the argument became, how long was the tunnel going to be? Um, the current plan is for a shorter tunnel that was originally envisaged, because campaigners and early plans envisaged a tunnel that ducks down under the ground at the edge of the World Heritage Site and came out at the far edge of the World Heritage Site and didn't cut across it.
Hmm.
The government said that was too expensive, so now there's what's called the short tunnel option, with dual carriageway across the rest of the World Heritage Site. And Grant Shapps, the Secretary of State for Transport, gave it the go ahead controversially, a few weeks ago in the middle of November, at which point everything has kicked off, because uh, there has been a vehement and well argued, although controversial in some quarters, uh, campaign led by a group called the Stonehenge Alliance,
Hmm.
which has campaigned for, as a minimum, an alternative route and a longer tunnel so as not to damage the World Heritage Site. Um, but other archaeologists and groups see it as a local amenity, but also one that is justifiable in heritage terms because the damage can be mitigated by archaeological research ahead of the actual development. In other words, they're treating it as a standard planning issue.
And I suppose one of the issues here, and actually I have to say throughout this conversation over the past 2 years, maybe possibly longer, I have been very specifically, I think, agnostic about it, in so much as I agree that quite possibly something needs to be done for people's ability to travel. It's also going to be better for the environment if people can just get through that area quicker. Um, and also, I've always seen the fact that there's a road there to begin with as an oddity, and then the idea that, oh no, we can't do anything else there, is a bit, the damage. Some damage has already been done, but then again, that's also not an argument for then slicing up the patient further just because they already have a scar on their face. Um, and this notion though that damage can be mitigated by doing archaeology is an interesting one but by virtue of the fact that the simple fact that archaeology is a destructive process. Excavation, and obviously I'm preaching to the choir when it comes to talking to you, and also hopefully people at home, and they recognise that an archaeological dig is in many ways, and usually, especially increasingly now, usually undertaken under very specific circumstances because you can't rewrap the present. Once it's been opened up, once it's been investigated, once the layers have been recorded, you can't put it back together again. It is a destructive investigative process. And then so therefore it wouldn't so much be mitigating it, I suppose it would be what was the word? It would be augmenting the destruction that's going to happen already. It would be, in that sense, maybe mitigating the loss, perhaps you could say, as opposed to actually the act of doing the digging. Um, but as you say, the Stonehenge Alliance have for example, started a crowd justice page campaign trying to raise £50,000 towards campaigning and lobbying against this project. They've currently raised £30,003 with 22 days to go on that. And beyond some of the I guess the internal responses, so there's that sort of archaeological question about whether or not digging the damage of digging can be mitigated by the gain in data, and also, for example, Stonehenge Alliance trying to raise money. All of that is fine and dandy. These conversations I think, are probably healthy, but it has quickly become clear to me that there's a bigger question here outside our own particular interest in our field, and that is actually how people view the discussion that's happening, and therefore how people view the archaeologists who are having the discussion. The Times ran with a headline that rival factions are battling for the soul of Stonehenge. And as I commented on Twitter, this is not a good look for archaeology necessarily, particularly as we frequently highlight on this series, when the lobbying power of archaeology in the world sector of heritage, when it comes to planning process, so on and so forth, is one that can easily be fragmented, seemingly for essentially you can always find an archaeologist who will have a different opinion, I suppose is what I'm saying, and therefore this notion of
Yeah,
rival
most of them work
factions.
as consultants.
Well, precisely, yes, they do. They work as consultants, and uh, therefore can be paid for their opinion, shall we say? And so and so I'm curious as to what this says about British archaeology, but also actually what this means in terms of how people view the sector and its ability to have a consensus. It looks like a bit of a mess, doesn't it?
It is a mess.
Hmm.
I The sequence in this is the Times ran that article arguing that there were two separate entities really in archaeology that were taking opposite sides, one of which being the academic sector who were arguing for preservation and research, and the other side were the development sector who were arguing that it was perfectly acceptable to build the A303 project as long as there was proper professional mitigation as per the British or the English planning system as it currently is.
Hmm.
Government's in the process of trying to streamline it and reform it in its own words.
Although to be
So
fair, and I don't mean to be overly glib here, but to be fair, there is a third faction mentioned in the Guardian article here, and that is that the Druids are facing defeat.
look,
Sorry, I'm being too
let's
silly there.
park that for a minute.
Yeah,
Let's park that for a moment. I'll come back to that in a minute because that's another important part of the
yeah,
discussion that's becoming it's becoming an extra strand, which is actually I think distracting people. But anyway,
yeah.
I'll come to that in a minute. Basically, it's been set up as a development archaeology versus academic archaeology argument, which isn't altogether true. A lot of academic archaeologists rely on data from the development sector, and a lot of development archaeologists are extremely highly qualified and do research, although there are limited opportunities to do primary research in the development field. It's mostly about retrieving evidence and putting it into archives so that it can then be accessed. Discuss. But so Archae Twitter and Archae social media immediately got very upset with the Times article, saying, "No, we're actually a united profession. We've got the same ethical views. We want to save the past, save the evidence of the past, and report the evidence of the past, and we've all got the same objective in mind." But this was then completely undercut by letters to the Guardian, where the current head of the CBA, Neil Redfern, and two other senior CBA officers wrote attacking the tunnel plan as it's currently envisaged and Grant Shapps' permission to go ahead, followed a week later by letters from the chief operating officers of the National Trust, Historic England and English Heritage, saying that it was an acceptable plan and and there was no reason why it shouldn't go ahead with proper archaeological mitigation. It's nonsense to suggest that the archaeological profession is united on this, because it's not, and that's why I think it's an absolutely seminal moment for archaeology as a profession, as a sector, but also actually for the public view of archaeology. Being very cynical, you could argue, for example, that commercial archaeological units like Wessex Archaeology and the other members of the consortium who are going to be doing the work on the project, if it goes ahead, have 35 million reasons why it should go ahead. That's 35 million pounds that is being sunk into the archaeology.
Yeah.
They have a vested commercial interest, and that cannot be overlooked. They are not objective parties. Neither of the National Trust, who is one of the largest landholders in the area, neither is Historic England, which is dependent on government funding for its very existence, and neither is English Heritage, which has been set up to operate independently by 2024, to be self-financing, and Stonehenge is its, I think, if not the biggest, certainly one of the two biggest paid visitor attractions that it actually has on its books to subsidise all the rest.
And all of that, obviously, in the context of being, I think we can almost say, a matter of hours away from actually leaving the EU exit transition period.
I think I don't. Astonishingly for me, I don't want to bring Brexit into this, because this will be happening. This will be happening regardless, because this is being done on the English planning system.
Yes.
And I think the real problem here, and I think the real issue that is being ducked by Archaeological World, is that what is being proposed here is a breach of international obligations under our relationship with UNESCO.
I thought you said you didn't want to bring Brexit into it. No, but see, the reason why I'm mentioning this is very specifically.
Okay. Let me just establish the point for our viewer. We're talking about a World Heritage Site, which is defined as having outstanding universal value, yet it is being treated as a local planning issue by the archaeologists, by the archaeological companies. I'm not going to say the individual archaeologists. It's not fair to actually tie this down to individuals. This is about corporate archaeology and its relationship with the government and its relationship with commercial entities. Yeah. And actually, and archaeological units operating as commercial entities, albeit charitable trust, which Wessex Archaeology is. It's an educational charity. Yep. It's established as an educational charity, not as a for-profit.
Yeah, a whole bunch of people. Who have to sing for their supper, and who rely on, for example, tourism and people coming into the area, all of which,
Yeah.
as well, in the context of an economy that could be about to enter tremendous tumult. So that's the only reason why I mention Brexit, is that there's actually the immediate financial outlook is very dodgy, and so 30 million plus reasons is a very good reason to be tempted to want that work, as it were. There's also, I suppose, this question, a broader question as well, in terms of how this relates to the role of archaeology and archaeologists in these big civil engineering projects. We've already touched on in a previous watching brief the questions surrounding the role of historic England when it came to building on portions of battlefields. And also this month, well, actually on the 1st of December, but we're squeezing it in. There was the headline coming out of Scotland where the benefits of roadworks to archaeology have been reviewed. Potential benefits to archaeology of road building projects is being reviewed by the University of Highlands and Islands. The study will focus on Transport Scotland's £3 billion dual augmenting the road to be a dual carriageway to the A9 between Inverness and Perth. And work done so far has uncovered artifacts linked to the 1689 Battle of Killiecrankie, as well as Iron Age finds from the Cairngorms. And actually, in this instance, a review by master's student Asta Pavillionit, I'm so sorry, I wasn't ready for that one, was actually funded by Transport Scotland. Her MA was funded by this to assess the archaeological merits of doing roadworks. It raises this question as to, again, this also adds to that question of how the public sees the role of archaeology, in so much as is it our job to, for example, in the case of battlefields, comment on the economic viability of a plan? Is it our job to go, yes, these roadworks will actually augment the archaeological record? Is it our job to help this destruction? As I say, or as I said earlier, the present cannot be rewrapped. It's an interesting question, and in that sense, it does, as the Times put it, it does go so far as to be about not only the soul of Stonehenge, but the soul of archaeology in this country, I would argue.
I think that archaeology has made a mistake by endorsing this project before the legal processes have run their course.
Mm.
We mentioned the Stonehenge Alliance and its crowdfunder earlier in the package, in the segment. That crowdfunder achieved its initial £20,000 target within 3 days, which for crowdfund, anyone who's worked on crowdfunders know that's quite a remarkable achievement, which suggests that there's a strong latent support for that particular cause out there in the community, and the fact that they're now forging on ahead to their 50 grand for what is called a judicial review of Grant Shapps' decision, the minister's decision, I think says something about the opposition to this project in certain quarters. Now, the government has a track record of losing judicial reviews on environmental grounds. And I think it was a big mistake for example, Wessex Archaeology to be part of a publicity campaign just before the Secretary of State made his decision, which was based on Wessex Archaeology being appointed as the lead archaeology company on the project, and the contract's worth £35 million. That was pure greenwash and spin on the part of Highways England, and it was designed to prepare the ground and influence the decision of the Secretary of State, I would argue. And I think it's a mistake for archaeology to allow itself to be used like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
That one of the key arguments in the judicial review is going to be whether, in legal terms, the Secretary of State's decision was reasonable, given that UNESCO, who designated it as a World Heritage Site, with the agreement of the British government, and the British government agreed to take on commitments to that World Heritage Site.
I mean,
in terms of its
well,
reservations.
but
It's important.
hang on. But heck, actually, people even seek out UNESCO status, often actually for commercial reasons. It's very, I know local
Yeah,
monuments have been desperate for it. So yeah, it's not
yeah.
doesn't just come with responsibilities. It's also a real boon to the monument
It's a,
itself.
it's a marketing tool.
Yeah.
Absolutely, it's a marketing tool for the local tourist
Hmm.
authority. The point, though, is that you take on a government accepting UNESCO World Heritage status takes on responsibilities, as do all the local authorities in the area who have
Mm,
part of it on their patch.
mm,
And in this case, UNESCO have opposed the current plan, um, and an independent planning body run by the Independent Planning Inspectorate, planning inquiry run by the Planning Inspectorate, found that the current plan would cause permanent and irrevocable harm to the World Heritage Site.
mm.
That's the highest level of damage under the planning rules, and normally it would have to be an exceptional reason to override that. Now, it's going to come down to whether getting to the West Country and the next traffic jam on the A303 a few minutes faster is reasonable grounds for damaging irrevocably a World Heritage Site. Now, I think archaeology, those archaeological groups should have waited for it did not take a legal genius to argue that if this was given the go-ahead, people would seek a judicial review, because on the face of it, it does seem like an unreasonable decision. At least you can make a case that it's unreasonable and therefore unlawful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to harness your horses to an unlawful decision that could be, sets a really bad international look in terms of damaging a World Heritage Site, I think that optically is a really bad mistake for the archaeology world. And I think it would have been better if archaeological bodies and archaeological companies had said, we will wait for this to run its course before we jump.
Mm-hmm.
But other people will argue that actually that's not practical, because Highways England has its own timetable, and they would have. The argument might be, well, they'd have gone to a foreign company for the contract if locally based companies weren't going to bid for it. There's always a counter argument, but as I say, I think at the moment it is not a good look that the archaeological establishment, for want of a better word, i.e. developer-funded archaeology and the leading archaeological bodies, with the exception of the CBA, and also ones that have been silent on this, like CIFA.
Well, and therefore attached notions of best practice as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm.
I just think it's not a good look, particularly if the case goes against the government.
Mm. Okay. It's probably also worthwhile just briefly mentioning at the end of this segment that I'm certainly not advocating that archaeologists are like monks. I'm not advocating some sort of Jedi like, separation of church and state when it comes to the relationship between archaeology and politics. Of course, there's going to be an interaction, especially when it comes to civil engineering projects.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
that question of the extent to which archaeologists are becoming people who negotiate ways of enabling the destruction of
Mm.
archaeological sites, as opposed to
Yeah.
the people who actually are leaning towards the question of, do we have to do this in the first place? There's an interesting balance there, but and it also is going to be inevitably one which requires compromise. But I just wanted to underscore this notion of
I,
I don't have an
I,
impractical expectation of archaeologists. Certainly not.
No, absolutely. What I would point our viewer to, though, is the irony that we've just had the 30th anniversary of really developer-funded archaeology with something called PPG 16, which embedded it in the English planning system.
Mm.
Under European law, the polluter pays principle was established so that a developer damaging the historic environment had to pay for that historic environment to be preserved by record. That came about because of a number of cases where major sites were destroyed by development or threatened by development, particularly the Rose Theatre in Southwark in South London,
Mm-hmm.
which was one of the earliest Tudor playhouses, and was the scene of the first performances of a number of Shakespeare's plays. It's an internationally important site in terms of theatre history and English language culture because of its connections with Marlowe and with Shakespeare. On that occasion, the archaeologists literally stood in front of bulldozers, as did members of the public. On this occasion, it can be argued archaeologists are enabling the bulldozers, and the former theatre worker in me, the storyteller in me, finds that a rich piece of irony.